In today's lesson, we're learning how to find the equation of a line with 2 points. As discussed in previous lessons, a linear relation is really just a pattern, and a pattern can be represented with an equation. These two equations mean exactly the same thing. In this graph, you've only been given two useful pieces of information. You know that figure 2 contains 7 blocks, and figure 3 contains 10 blocks. Using only this information, I want you to work backwards to find the initial value. First, we should try and find the rate of change. I want you to draw a triangle with these two dots. Now, it is an increase of 3 blocks for every one figure. Using this rate of change, we can work backwards to find the initial value, and that would be 1. Now that I know my initial value, I can represent this graph with an equation. The initial value, we just determined it to be 1, and the rate of change was an increase of 3 blocks for every one figure number. In other words, this would just be 3. Therefore, this situation can be represented with the equation y equals 3x plus 1, where y represents the number of blocks and x represents the figure number. In this graph, you've only been given two useful pieces of information. You know that figure 10 contains 31 blocks and figure 20 contains 61 blocks. I want you to use these 2 points to work backwards to find the initial value. We can start by finding the rate of change, which involves drawing a right triangle under these dots. The bottom of the triangle is going to be an increase of 10 figures because you're moving from 10 to the number 20. And over here, you're going to have an increase of 30 blocks, since that's how you get from 31 to 61. We just determined that there is an increase of 30 blocks for every 10 figures. But I want to know how many blocks are increasing for every one figure. Now, to solve this ratio, you can use mental math or you can use cross multiplication. I'm going to use mental math here, and there's going to be an increase of 3 blocks for every one figure, which means the rate of change really is just 3. You could use this rate of change and the 2 points in the graph we just saw to work backwards to find the initial value, but there's a faster way. We're going to use an equation and algebra to find the initial value. We already determined the rate of change earlier to be 3 because there's an increase of 3 blocks for every one figure number. We were also told that figure 10 contains 31 blocks. Now, the other piece of information was that figure 20 contained 61 blocks. You could use that as well. Either way, you'll get the same answer. At this point, we want to replace some of our variables with their known values. So I'm going to start by replacing y with the number 31. Next, I'm going to replace rate of change with 3. And last, I'm going to replace the variable of x with the number 10. And the initial value stays exactly the same. This looks a little strange. This looks like 310, but there's actually a multiplication sign in between these two numbers. In my next line of work, I'm going to simplify 3 times 10. Therefore, the 31 stays the same. 3 times 10 is 30, and the initial value stays in the same spot. At this point, I want you to look for like terms. You'll notice that 31 and 30 are both like terms. Like terms like to be together, which means you can move the 31 over to be with the 30, or you can move the 30 over to be with the 31. I'm going to move the 30 over to be with the 31. Remember, when you're moving terms across an equal sign, they become the opposite. So this 30 is no longer positive, it is now negative. This initial value is going to stay in the same spot, and we no longer need the positive sign, so I'm just going to erase it. At this point, this should be pretty straightforward. 31 subtract 30 gives you 1. Therefore, 1 is the initial value. Now that I have my initial value, I can represent this graph with an equation. So the initial value we just determined was 1, and the rate of change was 3, since it was an increase of 3 blocks for every one figure number. Therefore, this situation can be represented with the equation y equals 3x plus 1, where y represents the number of blocks and x represents the figure number.